The 34th Legislature Guam is called to order. Can I ask Senator Mary Camacho Torres to lead us in prayer? Senator Joe St. Augustine to do the national anthem and, the Guam hymn, and Senator Luis Muñoz to do the national anthem. Thank you. Senator Torres.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this glorious day. As we embark on the holidays, we ask that you keep us ever mindful of those in need, of those who are suffering with the separation from loved ones. We ask you to give us our blessings to perform our duties with an open mind and a compassionate heart. I'm reading from Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. We ask you, Heavenly Father, as we begin our session for the month of November, to give us the wisdom and the discernment that we need so that we may perform our duties to the best of our abilities, ever mindful of those who have entrusted us with this opportunity and this privilege to be of service as senators. In God's name we pray. Amen.
Recognition of recipient of Milad and Mas Tranquilo de Sacrificio. Senator Lee, you're recognized.
On behalf of the grateful island and country, we honor Seaman 2 Jose Santos Camacho and the family of Seaman 2 Jose Santos Camacho for making the ultimate sacrifice in service and defense of our island and country.
For the recitation of the Inifresi, you're recognized again, Senator Lee.
Inifresi, ginini mas takilu gino soku, imas takilu gikurasonhu, zani mas figu, nani nasinyahu, hu ufresen maisadzu, para bai protehi, zanu defendi, ihinengi, ikutura, ilingwahi, I airi, I hanum, zani tanu tamoru. Niren shaku diretu gininas zuus tata, esti hua fitma gihilu I Biblia. Zani banderahu I banderan guahan.
Senator Snugstein, Guam hymn.
Fanogi tamoru puritanota kanta imana itodu ilugar para I honra para I gloria Habiba isla sen para I honra, para I gloria, Habiba isla sen para todo I tempo I paz, para ita zan gini langit na bendición. Contra peligro naram safuham dus proteis languam. Contra peligro navan safuham dus proteis languam.
Senator Muñoz.
Stripes and bright stars.
Clerk, please take the roll.
Senator Atta, Senator Uggan, Senator Castro, Speaker Cruz, Senator Espadon, Senator Esteves, Senator Lee, Senator Morrison, Senator Muñoz, Senator Nelson, Senator Rodriguez, Senator San Augustine, Senator San Nicolas, Vice Speaker Chalahi, Senator Torres. Mr. Speaker, there is a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Majority Leader, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I move to approve the legislative journals dated October 23rd, 2017 and November 16, 2017, subject to corrections.
On the motions to approve the legislative journals dated October 23rd and November 16, 2017, any objection? Hearing none, motion carries. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are communications and petitions, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion to append communications and petitions, hearing no objections, so ordered. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are messages from Imag-Allahing Guahan, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion to append the messages from Imag-Allahi, any objection? Hearing none. You're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there are reports of standing committees, and I move that they also be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion to append reports of standing committees, hearing no objection. You're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there are no reports of select committees. Mr. Speaker, I move that bills introduced, bills number 201-34 through 203-34 LS and 204-34 through 212-34 COR. Resolutions introduced 276-34 through 282-34 LS and 283-34 through 299-34 COR, and certificates introduced, certificate numbers 156 through 34, -34 through 158-34 COR, 159-34 through 160-34 LS, and 161-34 through 195 COR be deemed to have been given their first reading.
On that motion, hearing no objection.
Mr. Speaker, I move that all congratulatory, commendatory, and condolence resolutions and legislative certificates introduced today and for the remainder of this legislative session be considered first read and adopted, to allow the legal counsel to make technical corrections, and to add all senators as co-sponsors.
On that motion, hearing none. On a motion to excuse.
Everybody's here. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I move to excuse senators not present for today's legislative session.
On that motion, hearing no objection.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place the following from the Committee on Housing, Utilities, Public Safety, and Homeland Security. Reports out the nomination of Sandra F. Bordallo, to serve as a member of the Guam Housing Corporation Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection.
From the Committee on Housing, Utilities, Public Safety, and Homeland Security, they have reported out the nomination of Tomas L.G. Flores and Francisco A. Floric to serve as members of the Guam Housing Corporation Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection.
Okay.
Are those all the legislative
Yes.
concurrence?
Just those three, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Thank you. I guess we're in second reading.
Thank you.
You're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I move to accept Bill number 209-34 as substituted on the floor. A copy of the substitute bill has been passed out. And to facilitate it, the new items that have been put into Bill 209 have been highlighted in gray. Got it. Thank you.
I think it's still being circulated. There is a motion to accept. Any senator wish to be heard or object? Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a question if the sponsor would yield.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I just to the amended piece, if he could just explain the reasoning for it, because this is a very complex bill, so I'd like if he could just explain the amended piece for us.
Senator, do you wish to yield?
Sure. Mr. Speaker, the Bill 209-34, as originally introduced, was simply to amend the budget amount for the fiscal year 2018 operating budget for the Guam Solid Waste Authority. What Bill 209-34 as substituted does is, of course, it amends the appropriation up to the full amount of $19 million, which is essentially what the receiver has been requiring to operate solid waste operations over the past 5 years. In addition to that, the substitute bill does a couple of things more, and these were all brought up at the public hearing. One, on page 1, you will see there on lines 9 through 12, the language that the appropriated sum of $19 million is inclusive of sums already expended in fiscal year 2018, and that any surpluses shall be available for appropriation. Basically, what that particular provision does, it addresses the concern that was raised by one of the members of the public hearing to ensure that it is not interpreted that in addition to what was expended already in the first quarter of fiscal year 2018, that we are giving them an additional $19 million on top of that. So what this language does, I believe, will clarify then that $19 million is all that will be made available for solid waste operations. What was expended to date, plus what is to be expended in the remaining 3 quarters to come. The other thing that the substitute bill addresses is the issue of the hiring of a comptroller. The bill The Enabling Act for the Guam Solid Waste Authority authorizes the agency to hire a chief financial officer. And the chief financial officer must meet certain qualifications, must have a CPA credential, must have a college degree in engineering, business management, or some other related field, must have so many years of experience in solid waste operations. So the agency, in trying to hire an individual to meet those qualifications, had difficulty finding that, at least for the salary that's being offered. However, there are candidates that are available that would meet the qualifications of a comptroller. And basically, then on page 2, line 26, it talks about the, well, on line 10, it authorizes the hiring of a controller. Line 26 on page 2 outlines what is the minimum qualifications. And sections 3 and 4 simply states that the comptroller will be hired in the unclassified service. So that is really the difference between what was introduced and the substitute bill.
Thank you very much, Senator. Is that satisfactory, Senator Nelson? Okay. On the motion to accept, any objection? You're recognized.
So I guess I pretty much explained what the bill is about. So, you know, what it accomplishes, it appropriates the full amount. And then if anybody wants to see where those figures come from, what the actual data was, I have that information available here, and we can actually, I can have copies made available. The question then is, why was only $7 million appropriated in the FY 2018 budget? One, because that's what the governor sent down. And when BBMR was asked, well, why did you only ask for $7 million? Because in the past, that's what Gov Guam had been paying for the solid waste division that was formerly with Department of Public Works. So that just kind of continued. But the other part to that is that the fact that really $7 million only represents about 37% of the annual operating costs, at least as experienced during this 5 years under the receivership. How was the $19 million determined? Again, the receiver provided actual budget data of expenditures and revenues, and the average annual cost is approximately $19 million. Now that the receivership is coming to an end, there is a provision in the Enabling Act of the Guam Solid Waste Authority which requires that the legislature be the one to approve the GSWA budget. And Bill 209 does that. And this is very important because the approval of a budget has been a major contention during the status hearings. And the status hearings are going to continue tomorrow at the district court. And certainly to be able to come in there and say, okay, we've addressed that, check it off. We want the operation back, hopefully. And so our action today on Bill 209 certainly is going to be very crucial to the discussion about ending the receivership. I've talked about what else Bill 209 does, and that is the providing authorization to hire a controller in the unclassified service. And let me just point out the fact that during the past 5 years that the receiver has had control of the solid waste operations, budgetary matters has been strictly between the receiver and the U.S. District Court, and really Gov Guam was, you know, the money, when the tipping fees were collected, the receiver received it, made payments to the appropriate accounts, made payments to receive to the payables, and Gov Guam really didn't see any of that money. So now that is ending, and now that ball will be in our court, and the law does require that the legislature approve the budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard? On the main motion, Bill 209. Any senator wish to speak? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the amended version, the substituted version, because that was I who brought up the issue about the amount that should be appropriated, noting full well that, in essence, the budget required for solid waste operations is about $19.5 million. And my question during the public hearing was whether the $19.5 million should be reduced by 1/4 because the receiver will have had 3 months of operations in fiscal 2018, basically from October, November, and December, and then it gets turned over, the operation of the solid waste gets turned over to the Solid Waste Authority. And so I appreciate the author's intent to basically quantify really how much it is. It's 19.5 with the understanding that that includes any sum that was expended in fiscal year 2018, at least as it reads right now. I just want to perhaps put out the notion that some sums may not have been expended but have been encumbered already, and those are two different things. Having been expended means it was spent already. Having been encumbered means that we have perhaps made a contract or have an obligation that has yet to be paid, but it is due. So I would like to perhaps make a motion, perhaps after on line 10, to have it read after the word expended. Let me just read the whole thing. The appropriate sum of $19.566.983 million is inclusive of sums already expended, and then the new words would be or encumbered by the court-appointed receiver in fiscal 2018. So it's very clear that anything that the receiver has already spent or has encumbered in fiscal 2018, again, will not be going to the Solid Waste Authority. So because, again, the intent here is to make sure that the overall sum that is not spent or encumbered by the receiver for 2018, that total is what will go towards the Solid Waste Authority. So the added language, I don't have it written down, but it's a very simple phrase, after the word expended or encumbered by the court-appointed receiver.
Thank you, Senator. On the Espaldon amendment to add the words and or encumbered
By the court-appointed receiver.
By the court or receiver. Anyone wish to speak on the Espaldon amendment? On the Espaldon amendment? Any objection? Senator,
Can you just repeat exactly where, please?
On line 10, after the word expended, and it will read expended or encumbered by the court-appointed receiver in fiscal 2018. On line 10, it'll be after the word expended, and the words will be or encumbered by the court-appointed receiver in fiscal year 2018.
any senator wish to be heard on the Espaldon amendment? Any objection to the Espaldon amendment? Thank you, Senator. Anything further?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I definitely support the ability and what we're granting here in terms of allowing the Solid Waste Authority the discretion to be able to hire a comptroller, because we all know that they're starting up again. We want to make sure that we have somebody there who will keep track of the financial and help the board with its financials and making sure that going forward, that if there needs to be, bottom line, just make sure everybody understands what the numbers are. So, because in the end, there may be the need to either increase the fees, and we just want to make sure that there are a set of eyes who understands the financial figures that are available, and to make be able to make the wise decisions along those lines. So I stand in full support of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator Espaldon. Any senator wish to be heard on the main motion? On the main motion, Bill 209. Vice Speaker.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. And I would just like to, first I'd like to ask one question of the sponsor, if he would yield. It's regarding the word operations in the amended version. Well, I guess in both versions, we give this money for operations, and during the public hearing, when we looked at the receiver's budget, there was if I read this correctly, there's a total expenditures approximately 13 million for what looked like operations to me, but then there are required reserves, and I just want to know if when we say we're going to put this towards operations, does that mean they do not need to put it towards these required reserves, or should we specify that a significant portion of this is going to the required reserves?
Senator,
or these different accounts that the receiver had listed, including cell closure, equipment replacement, new cell development, post-closure account, reserve for unfunded expenses?
do you yield?
I think that's a good question, Mr. Speaker, and it certainly wouldn't hurt to be more precise and to say that it is appropriated for operational expenditures and required reserves. So are you making an amendment?
I guess I'll make that amendment, Mr. Speaker. I hope it is legally sound, but I'll make that amendment to on line 9, where it says for its operations and required reserves.
Clear to everybody. On line 9, after the fourth word, operations and required reserves. Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the amendment.
On the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand and I appreciate that. I guess the question that then needs to be asked is whether the reserves are required and required by whom. Because if the reserves are required by the court upon the federal receiver, does the federal court have the same authority to mandate that requirement, or did they, or will they, once they turn over the operations to the Solid Waste Authority? So if we say for its operations and required reserves, the question begs, is it really required, and by whom? Because if there are no required reserves, if there are no, then
I'd imagine that there's always a reserve in any kind of company, but do you yield?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that is a good question. First of all, I think when at least on the data sheet that's been provided, it shows there a section for required reserves. Now, whether that's required by the district court or just really an operational requirement as such, I'm not sure. But for sure, we certainly want to establish a sinking fund for, because eventually we're going to need to open a new cell. And it also costs money to close a cell. Provide again a sinking fund for equipment replacement. So just looking at that particular data sheet of the categories of what reserves are, being put aside, then certainly it makes good operational sense. Now the fact is that unless we allow the Solid Waste Authority to approve their own budget the way other autonomous agencies do, they're going to have to come back here next year, and they're going to have to submit their budget for approval. And at that time, we can take a look at, do we still need to set aside $4 million for unfunded expenses, whatever that might be. But for now, I would suggest that we use the data that's been provided by the receiver on what is being proposed as the FY 2018 budget.
Is that satisfactory to the two of you? Vice Speaker, is that?
The answer is, for me, is that it makes sense in terms of what the author addressed, in terms of making sure that we do put aside some funding for future purposes, such as opening new cells. I think anybody who has any familiarity with the leads on landfill knows that within a certain period of time, which will be coming up, we do need to open up some more cells to receive the waste. The issue, though, again begs the question as for its operations and required reserves. If once the turnover happens and the courts really is the one who mandated the required reserves upon the receiver, but it no longer is applicable to the Solid Waste Authority, that means, in my mind, that the authority then, since there would be no required reserves, if that situation did transpire, that the authority then has the full ability to use that extra money to do whatever it wants. But again, notwithstanding the fact that it would make the most sense that they continue to put aside some reserves for future use. I will not object at this time, but I believe it's something at least think about. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. On the on the Vice Speaker's amendment, any other senator wish to be heard? On the Vice Speaker's amendment and required reserves, any objection? Vice Speaker, you recognized for anything further?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I just wanted to point out that I share the sentiments of the retiring speaker. It is very confusing. We've just received a new order from the district court stating that it might extend the receivership even further, and for various reasons. One is this post-closure ORDOT, and it looks like there will be a trustee in place for, at the last hearing it said 28 years, but I'm not sure what the most recent order says about the length of that trusteeship. But so I was very concerned when I first saw this bill, because I wondered why, if we have our new Solid Waste Authority, they did not point this out during the budget hearings, or at any time, that this amount was not enough. And I saw that it was the amount that the governor had requested, the $7 million versus $19 million, and that he had requested that the balance of this fund be put into for the hospital. And so I thought before the public hearing, well, great, maybe that money is available and we can do something with it, but I wish we had known about it during the budget. But I am going to agree at this point, because it looks like we have no choice either. The court is ordering that we adopt a budget that reflects what the receiver's budget was, and not without our authority knowing any more than that. They're kind of, I think, they've stated they're going to have to follow the receiver's budget at first until they can hopefully find some savings. I mean, that's, I think, what the governor was looking at, that we were going to operate this at some savings versus how it's being operated now, and I guess we can be hopeful for that. I am very hopeful for that because this amount of money from the solid waste fund does not at all cover the bond proceeds, and I am very wary about any increase, and especially the residential fees. I think it's just going to be an environmental disaster for Guam. So I'm hoping that they will succeed, that this authority, I know we have very competent people there, and I'm hoping very much that they are going to succeed in keeping expenses below this amount, and hopefully find some savings that we can use to pay off some of that bond proceeds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Vice Speaker. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? Oh, wait, there's no objection. Oh, we got past your amendment. On the main motion, Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm also a little bit concerned about the change in the requirement to $19,566,000 when the original requirement was $7 million. And so, you know, just to understand this a little bit, it seems that we're making our actions based on the court-ordered rulings. So I understand that there's a reason for this change, but there's going to be a trustee put in place that will oversee the money coming into GSWA. And so the trustee is going to ensure that money is being put for the closure for the ORDOT landfill. And it's not exactly clear when or how long this trustee will be in operation to close down the ORDOT landfill. And then once the trustee is done ensuring that the money's being put into ORDOT landfill, he's going to funnel the money down to GSWA, where thereby in this bill, the comptroller or the CFO will be able to manage the money to ensure that GSWA is a stable, autonomous agency. And so one thing that is unclear to me is that because the court is ordering that we have a trustee in place, and I believe this is because it will still be under the federal receivership guideline, that's unclear to me. And so maybe the sponsor can share a little bit about the role of the trustee and perhaps how much the fees that they are going to take off for their service. And then if he would yield to that question, I have another question after that.
Senator Adda?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the status hearings, the issue about a trustee was brought up. And the trustee basically was to serve the role of ensuring that funds are being set aside that will be sufficient to pay for the post-closure actions to follow on the ORDOT closure project. And so the way it's going to work is that the trustee, and of course that's going to have to be put out on an RFP, and I imagine that's going to be given to whoever based on, I'm not sure what the criteria will be, but that will be put out. Who the trustee will be based on a selection made through an RFP. Now the RFP, or the trustee will actually, is going to be set up so that he receives, the trustee receives the revenue from the commercial tipping fees. And that annual amount is about $10 million. The trustee will then take off the top of that an amount that is necessary to pay for the engineer and the operator for the post-closure activities that follow at the ORDOT dump. What that expense would be, we don't know right now until, again, that contract is awarded. But whatever that amount is that is set aside, the balance of that is then given to the Guam Solid Waste Authority, who will then use that for their operational requirements. So that's basically what that's going to be. The discussion There was a long, drawn-out discussion at district court saying, well, why do we need to hire a trustee? Why don't we just leave that responsibility to the Solid Waste Authority Board of Directors? And went back and forth, back and forth. Again, tomorrow's status hearing, I think, will give us a clearer picture about that particular issue, about the issue of do we now terminate the receiver on the operations side of the house and give that to Gov Guam? We'll know that all tomorrow.
Senator Nelson, is that satisfactory?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I just have one last question, and I'll be done. So if the revenue is coming in at $10 million, and we are appropriating minus the first quarter, 19.5 million, where will the additional 9.5 million come from? Are we anticipating that GSWA will raise the rates, or is this going to come out of another funding source?
Please repeat.
I'll try again. The sponsor of the bill said that the money that usually comes in is around $10 million that the trustee will then divvy out to respective areas, one to the ODOT landfill closure, and then the other down to GSWA. And so if I'm just thinking, what we're doing is we're appropriating $19.5 million. So where does the additional money come from, the 9.5 that we'll need? Where is that? Is that going to come from us having to, are we going to have to increase rates for those that are paying for their trash, or the 9.5 million is going to come out of a general fund or a special fund? I'm wondering where's the money coming from, Mr. Speaker, that's all.
Senator Abbott?
First of all, we don't know what the cost is going to be for the post-closure activities. All right, the cost of the engineer that would be monitoring that, the cost of the operator, the cost of the trustee, and so I can only reasonably guess that that's going to come under this. Well, let me put it this way: wherever that money is going to come from, I don't think they're going to go running to the PUC to seek a rate increase. It's going to have to come out of the operating expenses. So what's projected, and I'll be making an amendment, what's projected for FY 2018 is a revenue of $19,391,000, and so they're going to have to live within that amount. Again, it's an unknown that's hanging out there, and would it be in that? Well, we have the post-closure account. If you look there in the data sheet under the required reserves, we do have the post-closure account, of which they've been setting aside $100,000 every year since back since 2012. You can see there's that post-closure account. They've been putting away $100,000 into that account, and it's also being budgeted for 2018. So it's going to have to come out. I imagine that's where it's going to come out from. How they arrived at $100,000 a year, I imagine you had some smart engineers who figured what the cost might be.
Senator Nelson, is that satisfactory?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a little bit. I'm a little bit cautious because there's so many unknowns. A lot of it is determined by the courts, but I understand that there's some necessary measures that need to be taken to prove that GSWA can operate on its own. And really, essentially, this federal receivership has put us back millions and millions of dollars. So that's all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator on the main motion? Senator Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, in listening to the back and forth, I think what gets a lot of us a little cautious about this is what is the immediate impact going to be in terms of will GSWA go in and seek a rate increase? And in looking at the bill itself, though, what I think gives me a little bit of comfort is knowing that there is a section on page 2 that was inserted that would restrict the transfer of any of these funds out by the Imagatlahin Guahan to repay some of the debt service of the 2009 bonds that were taken out of Section 30. So I think with that alone, you know, that would give us pause at least to have this measure settle, have the receivership terminated, and have, you know, the GSWA start to operate on its own. And I think what we have to recognize, though, is that inevitably we are going to see a rate increase. We know that if there's any way that we can relieve Section 30 monies, maybe restructure the pledge of those funds to the bond repayment, that it is going to come out of our pocketbooks. And, you know, that's something that we just have to almost be resigned to. But with all measures that require progress, there's always a cost to bear. And it unfortunately comes down to the general public. But I think, though, that, you know, the author did a good job of, in looking at the committee report, all the concerns that were brought up, I believe, have been addressed in this bill. And if anything, it at least gives us the opportunity to move one step closer towards ending the receivership and having it operate again by the government of Guam. So I rise in support. I think, you know, at times it's difficult to know how much is too much and how much is bearable, and, you know, at what point are we going to break the backs of our community. But I think also progress does need to be made in some ways. So this is a good first step towards facilitating the process in ending the receivership. And I rise in support of this bill.
Thank you very much, Senator Torres. Any other senator wish to be heard? On the main motion? On the main motion? On the main motion? If not, Senator Addy, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I close, I'd like to just make one amendment. On page 1, line 7, an amendment to the amount that is being appropriated. And on there, I had the amount $19,566,000. I know I had a data source for that, but the data source that I have issued out, and this was in the committee report also, it shows that the estimated or the projected revenues for 2018 is $19,160,000. And so it seems then that from a budgetary standpoint, what we should be appropriating is the projected revenue of $19,160,000, not the $19,566,000. Because then we would be, then if they went and they spent the full $19.6 million, then they will be running into a deficit.
Does everybody see that on page 2 of what was handed out to us? The revenue was 19,160. Is there any objection to amending the appropriation and the title? Well, I guess not a title, but just line 5 and 6 and 7. to 19-160. Any objection?
And one final amendment, Mr. Speaker, is I'd like to add on as co-sponsors yourself and followed by Senator James Espaldon.
On that motion? Hearing no objection.
And so with that, I would ask my colleagues, well, I hope that by the end of the day we...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but on behalf of a colleague who wanted to ask a question, if I may,
please,
if that's possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to ask if the author can just yield to a question. It's just been brought to my attention that under, let me just get it real quick. GSWA Law 10 GCA, Chapter 51. It seems duplicative that there is a part of the law that there's a chief financial officer that the board may appoint that. So I'm not sure if it's what the difference is between a comptroller and a CFO. If the author can just yield to that question.
Well, if we take a look at what the Enabling Act requires of a chief financial officer, it requires that individual to hold a CPA credential. A comptroller is not required to have a CPA credential, but must have at least 5 years in the bill. We talk about must have at least 5 years of experience in the overall combined accounting and financing. Certainly the comptroller, there's less of a requirement in terms of credentials. The chief financial officer must have at least, I believe in the law, it requires at least 5 years of experience in working with a similar size solid waste operation, and must have, and is very specific, must have a bachelor's degree in engineering or business management. So it's just the skill level, I guess we could say. Now, we haven't been able to find anyone to fill the CFO position at the salary that's being offered, but there certainly are candidates that are willing to step up as comptrollers and be able to fill that role.
Is that satisfactory, Senator Munoz? Okay. Senator Addott, you were closing.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that we'll be able to act on the measure by the end of the day, so that at least we'll have something to be able to take to the status hearing tomorrow to show that we are, in fact, making positive moves towards ending the receivership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Addott. It was my intent that we address this and the two bond bills this morning and this afternoon, engross them and vote on them this afternoon. I know I hadn't announced it, but that was my intent, to try to address your issue and to address GPA and PAG so that they can all get back to work. We'll vote today, sometime this afternoon. Okay? Thank you. On the motion to send 209 to the voting file. Bill 157, Senator Uggan, you recognized.
Good morning and half a day, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for the placement of Bill number 157-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication in the third reading file. And because there has been a request by a number of members of this body that we break to Committee in the whole, I'd like to request that consideration so that we would allow representatives from the Port Authority of Guam to be able to respond to direct questions from members of the body, acknowledging the statement that you just made a few minutes ago.
Is there still a request for a committee of the whole on this bill? I guess, yes. All right. Fine. On that motion to place Bill 157 in the third reading and to resolve in the committee of the whole for the purpose of hearing testimony and having the members question, we'll take a short recess while we set up.
Good morning, fellow colleagues. I want to thank you very much for suggesting committee in the whole, because I know there are a number of questions that our colleagues wanted answered before we proceed further. I want to also extend my appreciation to the chairperson, speaker, the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication for having the public hearing on this measure and ensuring that it's reported out of the committee with the additional information that was requested not only during the public hearing but also subsequent to that public hearing. There were additional questions posed to representatives of the Port Authority of Guam in regards to this proposed legislation. We are entertaining Bill number 157-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication. So, Senators, if you have that version before you, and as we proceed with the discussion, the format will be, I will highlight the changes that have been made by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication. I will yield to the Port Authority General Manager, Executive Manager, Senator Joanne Brown, to provide some opening comments, and then I will yield to the floor for any of your questions or inquiries with regards to the proposed legislation. We do have representatives not only from the Port, and I'll have them identify themselves, but we also have a representative from the Guam Economic Development Authority that's going to assist with the financing of this bond acquisition. Senators, I'm going to read off of a digest that was provided by the good speaker and his committee with regards to changes to the original legislation that was introduced. And it reads, following the measures public hearing, the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication made the following changes to Bill number 157-34 COR. Reformatted the identification of projects and items in outline form in Section 3. Added language in Section 3(1)A to identify the specific name of the federal grant from which local matching funds are to be provided from the bond proceeds, which now reads the insertion of the words for transportation investment generating economic recovery Tiger Grant Program funding. Third, amended language in Section 3(1)A to separate the identification of funding between the repair of the equipment maintenance and repair building, EQMR, and the repair of Warehouse 1, and included an amount of $3,628,800 for such repair of the EQMR building per information provided by the Port Authority of Guam, which now reads, repair of equipment maintenance and repair building EQMR in the approximate amount of $3,628,800 and the repair of Warehouse 1, and it continues to read in the approximate amount of $2 million. Fourth item, deleted the original Section 3(1)A, refinancing. Yes, Senators, and I will see if I can get a clean copy of this from the committee, and I will distribute it to you shortly. Item number 4, deleted the original Section 3(1)A, refinancing the ANZ Guam Incorporated loan made in October 2010 per statements made by the Port Authority of Guam, where such refinancing was determined to not be at least 2% less than the present value of debt service, which now reads, sub-item number 2, refinance all or a portion of the following outstanding loans of the authority, and sub-item A is deleted, which reads, a loan in the original amount of $3.5 million from ANZ Guam Incorporated, made in October 2010. So that particular item of refinancing option has been deleted by the committee. The fifth item, amended Section 3(4), sub-item 4, relative to the cap on the principal amount of the bond authorization from $80 million to $70 million. Based on the Guam Economic Development Authority's March 2017 debt abstract, the remaining principal balance on the 3 outstanding Port Authority of Guam loans was $19,677,635, and it provides an appropriate breakdown as provided for in the proposed legislation. And once again, just for everyone so that I can re-highlight that particular amendment that was made by the committee, the principal amount of the bond authorization was adjusted, the cap, from $80 million to $70 million, based on the refinancing option as well as the projects identified therein. And then the final amendment by the committee amended Section 3.4 relative to the yield to bondholders not exceeding 7% to 6.5%. Testimony provided by the Port Authority of Guam indicated that their initial analysis of the bond financing and refinancing calculations assumed a 5.9% interest rate. To provide a balance of cost against the original assumption from which the analysis was based, the committee believes that 6.5% provides adequate flexibility to the Port Authority of Guam and the Guam Economic Development Authority to issue this bond. So those were the additional amendments made by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication, and I will proceed and allow the Executive Manager to provide some opening comments, and then Senators, if you have any questions, please signify by raising your hands, and we will proceed by the order of Senators identified. Okay, Senator Brown, if you can identify yourself and your team members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and certainly thank you to the members of the Guam Legislature and the Speaker for allowing us to be before you today to discuss Bill 157 for the bond bill for the Port Authority of Guam. To my immediate right is Felix Berto Alfred Duenas, who is our Deputy General Manager for Administration and Finance, and to his right is Felix Pangilinan, who is our Deputy General Manager for Operations. Again, I'm sure we're here to answer any questions or comments that the body may have to assist us in facilitating the hopeful passage of Bill 157 so that we can address these critical infrastructure needs of the Port Authority of Guam. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. And if we can have the representative from the Guam Economic Development Authority identify yourself.
Hafa and good morning. My name is Christina Garcia, and I'm the Public Finance Manager at the Guam Economic Development Authority.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Espadon, you're
I apologize. However, I think in previous discussions, the Committee of the Whole, when it deals with financial matters, we've required that the members be sworn in to testify truthfully.
Thank you very much for that reminder. Thank you, Senator Espadon.
Thank you.
Ms. Christine, if you can finish identifying yourself, and then we'll proceed.
Okay. Thank you. And again, representing the Guam Economic Development Authority, and here to answer questions as it relates to the bond financing process and any other information about the debt financing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Garcia. And to members of the panel, if I can ask you to please stand. Sergeant at Arms, if you can swear in the representatives, please. Thank you very much, Sergeant at Arms, and also Senator Espadon. Thank you for that reminder. Senators, I will now open the floor to any questions, and as we open that floor, there's just a couple of questions I'd like to pose initially to the General Manager so that we can get direct responses with regards to these particular issues. First and foremost is the committee has selected to recommend back to the body the reduction in the amount of the cap from $80 million to $70 million. So any particular comment in regards to that? And then I have one other additional question, and then we can proceed with questions from the floor.
Mr. Chairman, we are requesting to reinstate the cap at $80 million for several things. First of all, we have a very aggressive bond financing program, and we try our best to come up with the best estimates for our construction part. With the situation that we have right now with the foreign labor force not being available, we're kind of leery that might drive up the cost of the construction for these projects. That's one part. And the other part, as the tax reform program is being worked on by the United States Congress, there are several things in there that would jeopardize or have an impact on our borrowing ability. should the restriction or should the proposal to eliminate the tax-exempt bond for municipal bonds, should that pass through, that would increase potentially the interest rate, but more so, it would have a play in what our reserve requirement may be. So with those reasons, we would like to reinstate the balance back up to $80 million.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duenas. And a follow-on question is the interest that was amended by the committee from a cap of 7% was adjusted downward to 6.5% with the explanation. Can I hear some comments with regards to that particular change?
Well, again, like I stated earlier, with the withdrawal of the tax-exempt status on certain municipal bonds, that would drive our aggregate rate to a higher taxable bond rate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duenas. Senators, colleagues, I'm going to inquire directly. The Speaker, you'll be recognized shortly. Inquire with our legislative legal counsel because there have been questions raised about the application of Public Law 24, excuse me, 24-222 as it applies to increasing fees as well as the borrowing authority of the government of Guam with the requirement that we go before the people of Guam. So I'm going to request clarification from our legal counsel to be provided a little later during the course of the discussion on the applicability of Public Law 24-222 to the proposed legislation before us. So I wanted to provide you that information as we proceed with our conversation. Speaker Cruz, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there was two things that I just wanted to add. I know that the that Mr. Duenas has asked to increase the cap from 70 to 80. If you'll notice from what you circulated, the total on the second page, the total amount of projects comes up to $65,006,435. The committee left the cap at 70, reduced the cap to 70 because we figured that that additional $5 million should be sufficient for any cost overrun with the new cost of construction. I will be very honest, Mr. Chairman. I was leery with a $15 million difference between what was actually listed and what the cap was at 80. I know no one wants to talk about it, but I will talk about the elephant that's in the room. There were some suspicions and some concerns that that $15 million looked coincidentally equal to the amount that's due and outstanding to YTK. And that was not discussed, and so we reduced it to 70. We gave them a sufficient buffer for additional cost and made sure that it didn't look like there was a $15 million amount there that could be available. I wasn't sure whether or not it would be appropriate in the legislation to include a prohibition against paying that off or some kind of protection against that, but there were some statements that were made and concerns about whether or not this bond was going to be used for it. And so I wanted very clearly on this record that it was not the intent, because it never had been testified to by the port, that they were going to use this bond authorization to pay off YTK. I want that on the record, and I also wanted it clear why we reduced it down to 70. I would object to it going back up to 80 unless they can show me that these were the numbers they gave us, and we added it up and came up to 65. I think a buffer of $5 million is sufficient. A buffer of 15 is 25%, and that's just a little much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Any comments from Representative? Senator Brown?
I certainly appreciate the question by the Speaker, but there's been no action by the Port that's contrary to our position in opposition to address payment to YTK. As you know, that matter is soon to be before the Supreme Court with regards to our position, and there's no action taken by our administration in any way, shape, or form by the Port to address payment to YTK. We've been very consistent in our position. We certainly appreciate the support of the Guam Legislature recently with the filing of an amicus curiae brief, essentially outlining what was intended with the original legislation that granted the Port 5 years to address leases without legislative approval, and certainly anything beyond that required legislative approval. So we've been very consistent with that position, Mr. Speaker. I think we've worked together. I'm pretty much straightforward with how I go about doing what I do. We have consistently fought this issue. We don't acknowledge it in terms of any right that we believe that YTK has, claiming this amount from the Port, irrelevant of the actions of the arbitration panel. So I don't think you're going to see anything inconsistent with that with us. If it provides you comfort to provide any type of amendment to this bill that would clarify that, I mean, you are welcome. That is your prerogative, certainly, to do so. But for the record, under oath, however you want to look at it, I mean, we've been very clear with our position that we are in full opposition to any payment. We have no intentions of taking anything out of this bond other than to address infrastructure repairs and improvement that are very desperately needed by the Port Authority of Guam. And certainly, if any action were taken by us or a future management team to extract these funds for anything other than what's authorized under law in this legislation, I think the bondholders and the PUC and certainly the Guam Legislature would be on that issue very quickly. But that's not anything certainly our administration is in support of to address in any way, shape, or form the payment of any funds, not even just bond funds, port funds, to pay YTK.
I appreciate that, and that I just wanted it on the record so that it would be stated. I may not need to put something in there. I'm sure Tina might be able to address whether or not that can be addressed in the covenants, but I just wanted it on the record. It wasn't testified to, so there was no reason for me to be including anything in it. I just added up what the projects were, and it came to 65. A small buffer of 5 was sufficient for the committee, and unless somebody can give better justification than what was given to increase it back up to 80, I would hope that we'd keep to 70.
Sir, on the proposed legislation, there are 2 uses of funds that is not quantified. Item 3 is to fund the capitalized interest with respect to the bonds. That figure was not identified. And the 4th one is to come up with the debt service reserve fund. That's another intended use of the proceeds.
I understand, but you didn't provide me with any number. How much would the Cap 5 be, and how much would it cost us by doing Cap 5? I really object to that kind of practice, and I'm not sure why you would need it. You got your approval from PUC for your increases for the next 5 years. There should be no reason for the Cap 5, and unless you can justify the other, the committee could not quantify it and could not justify it, and so we didn't provide for it, and that's why it's at 7.
Both of these items were presented to PUC for their review and their approval when we came in before the body. We not only listed our debts, we listed our projects, but we also listed the need for Cap I and the need for a reserve fund. And based on our needs, the tariff was passed, which factored in the cost of those 2 items.
And that would be a $15 million increase?
No. The Cap I and everything else, the Cap I itself, depending on the interest rate, CAPI could range anywhere from 2 to 4 million. And the reserve for the bond payment, that the final figure would be calculated based on the final rate that we are charged. Again, that's possibly 3 to 5 million for the reserve.
Yes, Ms. Garcia?
If I may add, since the introduction of the bill, we've had the review of both the Senate and House version of the tax reform bills. Both versions will affect these bonds in that the use of bonds for quote, private activity, which is very common for airports and ports, will no longer be allowed with tax-exempt financing, which means that, one, this will impact our final interest rate in that we're looking at the cost of interest a little bit higher than what we originally projected back in July. And our range is anywhere, it can go again, if we're talking 25-year debt, we're talking 6%, as high as 6% for long-term. For 30-year debt, we're looking at 6.5%. Again, what we're asking is being given the flexibility to go out and, again, trying to react or trying to respond to the new tax reform bills. We need to be able to have that flexibility to go forward with that financing without coming with having all the tools with us. In addition to the request to maintain the original par amount at 80 million, we will need a debt service reserve for this bond, and it's again similar to what we've done with airport bonds, and we're looking as high as a 5 million plus debt service reserve, again depending on where we are with the final financing. We're looking at 120 days out to complete this, so again we'll know more in a couple at that time. In addition to that, we're building new facilities, and common with any construction or capital improvement project, there is a year or two for capitalized interest, because again you're not having use of those facilities until they're completed within that 3-year construction period, and so it is common to have that capitalized interest during that construction period, and in this case, because of the extent of the projects, we're looking at probably accessing at least 2 to 3 years of capitalized interest. So again, you're looking at a 5 million debt service reserve, 5 million plus debt service reserve, and a year or two of capitalized interest. So that's where you come up with the 15 million. And so again, we're requesting to maintain that 80 million, just to be given the tools to secure the best interest rate and the best financing structure for the port.
Mr. Speaker, your mic, please.
So you're requesting to keep it at the 80 so that we can borrow an additional $15 million and pay interest on it while we sit around to make sure that you have a debt reserve to pay this off, and we're borrowing money to borrow money on top of it. And I just want it listed, because all I got from the testimony and from the 2 sets of letters that went down to the port were these projects. And if you want to put in that you want $5 million for a debt reserve, and you want to put in that you want $5 million for CAPI, then put it down so that you put it in your covenants, and we don't talk about that elephant in the room. But you guys, as Gita, need to be clear about what that is, and you put it in blood from you guys that this is the amount that you guys are asking for, so that you can. I'm not going to light my hair on fire, what little I have left, over a 0.5% interest income. But the thing is that I will be very, very hard on trying to justify $15 million. That just is not acceptable to me, unless you can add it on to the bottom of Gulf Pier, $5 million for Cap I, $5 million for reserve, and $5 million for cost overrun indifference. Whatever, but just have it down so that you explain to me why we're borrowing $80 million. Don't just say, well, I think I need this, I think I need that. That just, I'm not buying it.
Thank you very much, Speaker Cruz. The chair will entertain any amendments with regards to this ongoing conversation or discussion at a later time. So unless you have an amendment, Mr. Speaker? Very valid concerns. Thank you. Anyone else on?
Mr. Chair.
Yes. Madam Vice Speaker.
On the speakers and this discussion back and forth, could we please see that in writing? These extra costs that they're estimating, or the reserve fund, whatever. Yeah. Could we get that in writing?
Sure. Let me ask the representative from GITA to also add some additional comments.
Yes. Again, the authorization to fund the capitalized interest and the debt service reserve is in the proposed legislation, page 46, lines 20 and 21. It's, at this point, it would be a very rough estimate on what numbers we have, because one, this is the first financing for the Port Authority. We don't even know what the rating will be for the port. The rating agencies will make that determination once we come with them with the package. And our estimates, I mean, we believe that the credit is a BBB investment grade credit, which is similar to the airport, but again, we don't want to make that promise to you, and because the analysts will judge that on their own. And so, again, the authorization is there, and we're just requesting that the amount of $80 million be allowed to cover the cost of the capitalized interest, debt service reserve, and the cost of issuance is also allowed in there. So again, that was the purpose for having the max par amount at 80 mil.
Ms. Garcia, the chair recognizes your statement, but also there have been some questions raised with regards to specific amounts. We understand that until such time that the process is completed, you won't know the exact amount, but there was a request or suggestion by Speaker Cruz that an amount be associated with the annualized debt service as well as the interest cap requirements. So if I can ask GITA reps to prepare an amendment to that effect, and the chair will consider entertaining it at a later time.
Yes, sir.
Senators, any other questions? Senator Mike St. Nicholas, you're recognized, and then Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in reviewing Bill 157-34, there is a very curious part of the measure that just using, for example, Bill 139 as a reference is very different in terms of the debt authorization measures that I've seen in the past. If we look at Bill 139, it's about 4 pages long. And if we look at Bill 157, it's 47 pages long. Bill 139 is a refinancing of existing debt. Bill 157 is an authorization for new debt. But the new debt authorization in Bill 157, the language actually doesn't begin until page 45. And it doesn't begin until section 3. Everything prior to page 45, maybe with the exception of section 2, It's 44 pages that actually strike the existing Article 2 statute on Guam Port Authority bonds and rewrites the entire statute. And that, for me, is a huge curiosity, because we should be able to entertain a bond measure under the existing statute, and yet we completely rewrite it in this bill. And as I go through the rewrite of the statute, I notice some very key differences between the new statute and the old statute. And if my colleagues can just bear with me as we go through it. For me, the greatest curiosity begins on page 37, section 10221, bonds shall be secured by revenues of system. And it reads, starting on line 12, this lien shall arise automatically without the need for any action or authorization by Imagalahin Guahan, the government of Guam, the authority, or any other person or entity. I cite this language, Mr. Chairman, because this language is nowhere in the original statute. And this new language creates an automatic lien process. That kind of language is consistent further on page 37, line 25, and continues on to page 38, when it reads, in addition to the statutory lien provided for above, an indenture may provide that payment of the bonds and the interest thereon shall be secured by a pledge of and lien upon all or a portion of the revenues of the system. Any pledge and lien shall be valid and binding from the time the pledge is made without any further act.
Senator St. Nicholas, did you want a direct response from either GITA reps or the Port Authority on?
Well, I kind of wanted to first highlight the numerous differences and how it's almost, it reads to me like it's taking away the involvement of the governor in this process and making it strictly a decision made by the board or by the agency. And that concerns me because the board is appointed. It's not elected. So we have that language there. The last sentence on page 38, line 10, the indenture by which pledge is created need not be recorded. And when I raise this concern on page 37, if you go back to the original statute beginning on page 14, it very clearly says on line 5, adopted by the board and approved by the governor. It says on page 8 that was stricken out. Page 8, line 7 and 8. But the terms thereof shall in each case be provided for by the board with the approval of the governor. And then on page 7, lines 5 and 6, before issuing any bond or bonds, the board shall, by indenture approved by the governor. All of these references to the governor in the original statute are removed in this newly proposed language. And similar to the concern raised by our speaker, and while the administration's statements on the record are clear, the ability of the board to make these determinations don't even require the administration of the port. The board can just make the decision with this authorizing language to go ahead and make those payments. So while I appreciate the testimony of the general manager, ultimately the port with this new statute will have the full authority to do that without the need for even the governor's approval. And so I raise these questions because if we're able to do the funding of the new project just starting on page 45 and doing that on through page 47, why are we rewriting the entire Article 2 Guam Port Authority Revenue Bond Statute? Why can't we just grant this new borrowing authorization within the existing statute? Because these changes, they just kind of jump out at me that we're trying to line item out the governor from the process and vest all of the power into the board when the existing statute very clearly involves the governor. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator San Nicolas, for sharing your concern. Any response from the Port Authority? Mr. Duenas?
Yes, sir. Senator San Nicolas, the original authorization, Section 2, was drafted or adopted when the Port Authority was made an autonomous agency. From that date to now, no bond financing has ever occurred. So to bring it up to speed and everything else, what we did was we looked at other autonomous agencies and their legislation that deals with bond financing. Now, if you look at the new bill and you compare it to GWA and Guam Power Authority, you would find that those languages that you highlighted or changed, those are the same languages that are in those two utility agencies. So that was why we needed to do a rewrite of the entire section. Like I said, to bring it up to speed and to make it compatible with the other utilities that go out in the bond market.
Thank you, Mr. Duenas. Senator San Nicolas, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just feel more comfortable if we had a bond authorization legislation that was written specifically for the existing statute, rather than trying to rewrite the governing statute on revenue bonds while at the same time trying to authorize a revenue bond. It just, I mean, it seems like it's trying to do one thing, but at the same time tagging on something else. And I'm not quite sure exactly why there's a need for us to rewrite the entire Article 2. When I was looking through the existing Article 2 and comparing it to the proposed language here, starting on page 45, I just didn't see anything restricting in Article 2 that would prevent the authorization of the new issue. The only real changes I noticed were the removal of the governor from the process.
Senator San Nicolas, while you're working through the additional comments, I'd like to ask the General Manager if she can respond to your specific concern.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I mean, just to clarify, as mentioned by our Deputy for Administration, this is the very first time the Port Authority is actually venturing out in a bond. The Port Authority enabling legislation that created it was about 42 years ago, back in 1975. And so over the last 42 years, there's been no action with regards to the port initiating a bond. Since then, of course, we've had a number of other autonomous agencies that have come before this body to have bonds addressed. GPA, any more recent language you would have for GPA probably would not have addressed the original enabling language, because that would have been done probably early on in the process when GPA ventured out in its first bond. Very same case. I mean, I was here, we did the first $100 million bond for the Guam Waterworks Authority. So any recent legislation you might be dealing with for the Guam Waterworks Authority may not require the revisions, because those things would probably have been addressed during previous bond language and previous bond legislation that has been brought before the Guam Legislature. So I don't know that comparing this particular language to the most recent, I don't know what the most recent bill is that you're referencing, Senator, because I was not here at the time. But that is exactly what we're doing. We're taking a very first venture for the Guam Port Authority to move forward in being able to go out in the bond market and obtain bond financing to address upgraded and critical needs of infrastructure at the port. And so it did require us to address the revisions that were in the existing law that were created 42 years ago, and make those changes so that we actually have language in place that will allow us to move forward on the bond market and obtain the financing. At the end of the day, once these bonds are initiated, obviously we have responsibilities to address the payback of that. No different than if I borrowed money to buy a brand new car. If I don't make payments, I don't think the bank's going to ask me permission to come back and repossess my car or have other means of ensuring that payment is made on the vehicle if I'm to keep it. This is just a bigger project, a more sophisticated process of obviously in going out in the bond market, but there's no intent to simply sidestep anyone. It's a very public process. I'm fascinated by the conspiracy theories, probably a little rusty. It's been quite a few years since I've been here myself. But there's no intent other than to have language available so that we can meet the current requirements going on the bond market, not only to be able to borrow the money, but obviously bondholders are not going to loan us the money without insurances that they're going to be paid back. In the event we default, there have to be mechanisms in place to ensure that funding, revenue from the port will ensure payment of these bonds. No different than any other bond that's been executed by the territory with regards to financing. Those requirements are there. Fortunately, the government of Guam has never defaulted. If there's anything we've met, even in challenging financial times, is always ensuring that our bond payments are met so that we do have the flexibility as we do now to go back out and borrow additional funding. So I understand it's quite extensive. I mean, trust me, when we all originally looked at this bill, we were like, wow, why are all the crossouts? Why do we have to redo all this? But that's the main reason why. I mean, the world 42 years ago and the current bond market that we're in now is a very different dynamic, and that's why we have added the changes to the existing statute that were created many, many years ago that currently don't meet the requirements of where we're at today.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. Senator St. Nicholas, you still have the floor, but senators, I've been asked to take a 3-minute recess by our IT team so that they can reboot the sound system. Okay, so we will take a 3-minute recess.
with the board. The board, on page 27, line 15, the board shall determine the time, form, and manner of issuance of bonds. On line 26 and 27, before issuing any bond or bonds, the board shall declare the purpose for which the proceeds of the bonds proposed to be issued shall be expended and shall specify the maximum amount of bonds to be issued or sold for such purpose. On page 28, continuing on lines 5 and 6, the authority, not even the board, the authority may enter into indentures providing for the aggregate principal amount, date or dates, maturities, interest rates, or methods for determination thereof. Continuing on to line 14, section 1029, issue of bonds, which ends with the sentence, it is not necessary that all bonds of the same authorized issue be of the same kind of character, have the same security, or be of the same interest rate, but the terms thereof shall in each case be as set forth in such indenture that has been authorized by the board. So this new Article 2 will give the board or in conjunction with the authority, which I'm assuming is the management, the ability to basically craft their own borrowing plan, put that borrowing plan, basically approve it internally, and then just get approval from the PUC for whatever rate increase is necessary to fund it. My concern is that that would allow for revenue bonds to be floated without any real involvement from the people, because the port board is not elected, the PUC is not elected, and so I'm concerned about this rewrite of Article 2. And I don't know if this was intended or not, but I don't want to get into that discussion. I think that if we're going to stay focused on what the primary purpose was of this entire bill, I would like for us to instead just entertain Section 3, beginning on page 45, which is the borrowing authorization that has been very much spoken to over the last several months. And so, Mr. Chairman, notwithstanding any other conversations my colleagues may have, I am going to make a motion that we strike everything, I believe everything prior to Section 2, strike the entire Section 1. But I will defer that motion subject to any other conversations from my colleagues, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator St. Nicholas. Senator Nicholas, I'll come back to you a little later with your proposed amendment. Senator Esteves, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the first half of my line of questioning, the good senator from Dedito covered with regards to the non-elected status of the Port Authority board members. But going into my second portion, if we first refer to page 27, subsection 10206, which is the authorization and basically makes a statement that Guam will not be liable for debt incurred by the Port Authority of Guam. If first, based on my reading and my understanding on this, that this portion is to take that obligation away, and that in no way it is a lien against the people of Guam. Is that correct? Yes?
Did you want to respond?
Oh, it's just because the mic and they record. That's the only reason we just
yes,
needed
that's
to.
correct.
Okay. And then another portion further asserts, my apologies, would be on page, actually I'll just jump right here to page 39. So the language just seems a little inconsistent to me with regards to a pledge, which I understand is standard with most bond issuances from some of the other authorities. But with regard to that previous statement, with section 10229, the pledge by the government of Guam, which goes down to read, the government also is fully committed to ensuring that bondholders are protected and to ensure full and timely repayments of their bonds. If you go to the next page under that same section, under A, to fulfill the terms of any agreement made with bondholders in accordance with this article, to maintain the rights and remedies of bondholders provided in this article and any indenture, And so, and my question is just with this type of this language and with this pledge by the government of Guam and an inconsistent section further saying, okay, we're not liable for any debt, but at the same time, government of Guam will ensure that you get any payment. Can this be argued in any instance that Gov Guam is liable and that the general fund or any other government of Guam as a whole funding sources could be liable to used to pay this debt off if for whatever reason the Port Authority was not able to make its obligations?
No, that was not the...
Mr. Dueñas, if you can turn on the mic.
That was not the... that is not the intent to have the government or the general fund.
I'm sorry, Ken.
Speak closer to the mic, Mr. Dueñas.
That is not the intent of this legislation. The intent is to shelter the general fund and the government from liability.
I understand that, Mr. Dueñas, but did you read that section within the proposed bill, section 10229? Because I do understand that that's the intent, and we've had conversations that the port is an autonomous agency and they have the revenues to pay for the bond, to get the bond, to upgrade their facilities, and it will not affect government of Guam as a whole. I understand that. But my question is, with the pledge by the government of Guam to fulfill the bond covenants, is that in a way having government of Guam asserting itself in that process, and that can that be used to place liability on Gov Guam because it's going to be in statute?
It's more intended for the government not to interfere with the process to prevent the Port Authority.
But that's not what this section says. Did you read this section, Mr. Dueñas? I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
The first section that you
No, I'm talking about section 10229, pledged by the government of Guam.
23, the government also is fully committed to ensuring the bondholders are protected to ensure full and timely repayments of the bond. That's what I'm responding to.
And if you go further to read down in that section, basically it says that like other bonding mechanisms that they've used before, similar to the airport GPA, GWA, the government of Guam as a whole is basically, if you read it, and correct me if I'm wrong the way I'm reading it, well, one important factor is that they pledge to maintain the existence of the authority, which means they're not going to get in the way of the autonomous agency, touch their revenue sources, and basically leave them alone. But at the same time, the language in that pledge is very, very general in the way it reads, basically saying we will make sure that you as a bondholder will get repaid. And I guess my question is, could that in any way in legalese be construed as the government of Guam now becoming liable if the agency were to default for one reason or another? This, because we're putting it in statute. You know, it's not a piece of paper. It's going to be in law that it says right here, Gov Guam will make sure you get paid in a timely manner. And so I just want to make sure that before, if one, this pledge is absolutely necessary in all aspects, and two, if we can maybe just get a legal opinion if this could be held against us with regards to, in one area we're saying we're not liable, and in another we're saying, but we'll make sure you get paid.
If I may, Bond Council wrote the legislation with our review as well, but again, to recognize that the government of Guam says that the Port Authority is an autonomous agency, and as an autonomous agency, they recognize, one, that they are borrowing, and that they recognize the pledge of their system revenues. And again, language here was provided with the assistance of Bond Council, again, to specify that, one, the government of Guam is not going to interfere with decisions by PUC or the board as it relates to the bond covenants. Two, that they do recognize the bondholders as lien holders in this instance. The third is that they're not going to interfere the port's ability to run their operations, to pay their debt, meaning the governor, and again, it's similar language to, or it's what we've had to do for airport and water. And then the last one is to say that the government of Guam cannot take port funds out of port to use for non-port activities. And this may not be inclusive of everything, but this language is required, again, to ensure that the lien of the bondholders is recognized not only by the port and the legislature, but the government of Guam as well, that the bondholders do have a verified lien as recognized by the total government. So
Can you say that again?
That the bondholders have that lien. Should they port go out to borrow, they have that lien on port revenue, subject again to the ability of the port to run their operations. So when you talk about the flow of funds,
Right before that, though, I thought you just said the total government.
well, the government of Guam recognizes this, that they are going out for the bond, that there's going to be a pledge of the port revenues, and that they pledge not to interfere with port operations, and pledge not to take their funds basically out of the port to pay for other government services. So again, that's standard for autonomous agencies, to say that, you know, we have the ability to operate ourselves, and that the government of Guam won't come in and take our funds for other uses.
I see that aspect. I mean, it says it right there. The
Yes.
government of Guam is fully committed to ensuring that the authority has the ability to implement the capital improvements authorized to be financed by this piece of legislation. But I just don't really see the need for the language, which with the next sentence, the government is fully committed to ensuring that bondholders are protected and to ensure full and timely repayments of their bond. How is that related to, if we're to stay out of their way as autonomous agency, how could the government of Guam make that pledge to any bondholder? So it's either we're staying out of your business, but we can ensure that they have the financial solvency to do this, or we're not. But how can the government of Guam
it
pledge?
doesn't restrict us from giving them funds if they need funds.
Wait,
but
okay,
they recognize,
say that again?
It doesn't restrict the government of Guam to provide funds to them. It just restricts us from taking their funds for government purposes. So again, what has been happening in the bond market is again, without language like this, there have been instances, and I would have to find those instances for you, where the general government would actually go into their autonomous agencies, and again, pulling revenues from them to fund operations.
Yeah. And we don't want
Right.
that. But to go back to what you said, there's no preclusion from an instance where the government of Guam is paying into an autonomous agency for one reason or another. Is that correct?
Yeah, like if we wanted to fix their road,
Okay.
because it's part of our.
Now, how about
that's-
for repayment for any bond indentures?
So if, and again, they mentioned just like GPA, when GPA was failing, the government of Guam had to step in to help pay their debt. And so that's not restricted.
Was there a had to? I mean, in that specific story, had to? Was there any statutory requirement for them to go in and help them pay down their debt with GPA?
No. There was no statutory requirement, but again, the responsibility of making sure that the overall government is operating as need be, meaning the power is providing power, the port is providing their services.
I do get that. What I want to make sure is this bond, is the bonding measure, because I've looked at the documents, the port has the financial solvency, and it's not really an issue about that. It's just I'm just making sure that the lien on this in no way, shape, or form piles on to the already large amount of debt the government of Guam has as a whole. And that we're not having to come for whatever reason, you know, let's say there's a storm, there's a tsunami, there's a typhoon, major damage at the port, they have to do much needed repairs, they can't pay their bond. Is Gov Guam liable at that point? Is anybody going to come knocking at our doors saying, okay, the port can't pay, are you going to pay? And I think that's just really important information for the public to know at large, is even though we say we're not liable, are we ultimately going to be liable? For example, you know, your son can't pay his car note down. You know, might they be coming knocking at your door because your son happens to stay at your house? Are you having to deal with that mess? And that's what I think we really just need to establish here. Is so in that instance, is Gov Guam, based on the language that we're seeing here, ultimately going to be responsible for the bond indenture of an autonomous agency?
Senator, in that scenario and everything else, number one, the port is well insured, and we have our sources and everything else to make the required payment. Number two, that's the purpose of the debt service reserve account. Should something happen, you have the cash there to continue the making the debt payment. So those two instances, on a natural disaster, we have our funds ready. Our deductible is available. We have the cash to meet the deductible for typhoon, fire, earthquake.
So there are basically remedies that they would have to go through, and Gov Guam would not put in unless after they finish their reserves, finish everything, their insurance and everything, they would have to come to Gov Guam through the legislature to say, you know, we need assistance. So again, we're not pledged to help them. We would have to, I mean, it would be a whole process before we wouldn't have to be required to pay in automatically.
And then, Senator, I also want to add, I mean, we would be in a really catastrophic situation if we were ever to get to that point. Were the port for an indefinite period of time, for example, maybe there was a major earthquake and we were not able to operate our cranes and our wharfs were badly damaged, and we were not able to pay. I mean, there are mechanisms in place to ensure that the port, even if we had a typhoon, something that could have impacted us for a period of months, that we still would be able to address payment. If we were ever in that situation, I think the rest of Guam would be in trouble, including the government of Guam, if we were not able to ensure the movement of cargo through the port. And that's why certainly it's taken us many years even to get to the point in our financial responsibilities, audits and everything else, to even get to the point that we could even start the process of pursuing a bond, so that we can ensure we have that accountability and transparency. And then also, we are insured, and we are required through this process to set aside a reserve account. So in the event we had a natural disaster or other event that is recoverable, that the port would be able to carry those payments, even at a time for a period of time we're not able to generate revenue, because let's say something happened and we were inoperable for a period of time. But ultimately, worst case scenario, something catastrophic, assuming the government of Guam is still around, ultimately that does fall on the government. But I highly doubt it. Has not happened so far, at least in recent times. We were talking about back in the day of the load shedding, and back in the 1980s during the Ada Blas administration, where we had major problems with the Guam Power Authority. That's one of the reasons we initiated the creation of the CCU, to move that process from what was the Guam Legislature and the governor setting rates, for example. We go, and by legislation, we go through the PUC to address our rates. They review even in contract we enter into that's beyond $1 million, including federally funded grants, believe it or not. We have to go to the PUC and present our case and get their concurrence or their approval to be able to move forward with such, even if it is federal money, for example, that has negligible impact on rates, for example. They require us to do that. So we did. I was here when we took that authority away out of the Guam legislature and out of the administration to set rates. That's one of the reasons GPA crashed, is because, you know, politically there's nothing popular about raising rates. Nobody wants to raise rates, and for quite some time very little time or effort was put into expanding the generation capability of GPA, and we ended up spending an enormous amount of money on fast-track generators that we had to install around the island during the power crisis. So that's one of the reasons of the history, and it was brought up earlier that, you know, we have an appointed board. Well, the Guam Airport Authority, of which you have, not personally, but there have been other bond legislation, much higher amounts that have been moved through for the Guam Airport Authority. It also has an appointed board, but there is a process of accountability through either the appointed, through the elected governor, that those authorities do exist. So, I mean, there's no intent other than to ensure, of course, the bondholders are going to want to ensure that if they're paying us the money, they're going to want to ensure that they have the ability to be paid back, but they're also going to want to ensure that port funds are protected for port-related purposes, which historically in the past has not been the case. And that's one of the main reasons for this language.
Thank you. So, yes.
Senator, for the record, our insurance covers lost revenue as the time when we had the fire over there. The revenues that we lost from operations, the insurance covered that. We also have in our cash operating reserves 2 to 3 months worth of cash in the bank to take care of operations should something happen.
And thank you. You know, again, this is the first time the port is taking out a bond, and I agree. I think the purpose is definitely worth it. It's important. It's just time. But in doing that process, you know, in having this conversation and ensuring that we're going down this road, you know, it's good to know that there are checks and balances and word I'm looking for, redundancies in your systems of revenue to ensure that you guys are able to meet this obligation. I think that's the most important thing. The concern that at least I've heard from constituents is this going to affect our overall debt? Is this something that is just going to come back on the taxpayer as a whole? And I think you've answered well with regards to your ability. I've looked at your finances, and it is going to be nominal in order to do this. So I really think it's time that, and I do support the initiative of the port in moving forward with the bonding measure. But thank you for answering my questions. I will reserve the opportunity to speak at a later time if I come up with anything else. But that was the main thing that was definitely concerning me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves, and thank you for the responses from the panel. Senator Regine Bisco-Lee, I will recognize you as soon as we resume at 13:30, 1:30 this afternoon. Senators, we're going to take a recess until 1:30 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you.